Hello everyone. Tonight we open with something a little more somber, the Great Plague of London in 1665. You might imagine a city of mighty ships and bold explorations, an age of experiments and discovery. But for an ordinary Londoner, life was not a story of adventure, but a nightly question. How do we avoid dying before morning? The uncomfortable reality is that you likely wouldn't survive a single day there. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of work I share here. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. It's always intriguing to see who is joining us from all corners of the globe. Now, lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady background hum, and let us step together into tonight's journey. The winter of 1664 descended over London not like a clean white quilt, but as a sodden, colourless veil. It clung to the warped wooden frames of cramped houses, slid from sagging eaves, and transformed unpaved lanes into shallow lakes of mud and hopelessness. The cold felt almost sentient, like a living presence that crept through splits in the plaster and gaps in the doors, then settled deep into the joints and marrow of the Londoners it gripped. In the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, that cold seemed to bite a little harder. St. Giles was no proud, bustling city centre. It existed beyond the old Roman walls of London in the county of Middlesex, a swollen suburb that had grown without plan or mercy, a maze of cramped passages and shadowed courts. It was a district where houses leaned drunkenly against each other for support, blocking out what little weak sunlight might dare to break through the usual blanket of cloud. Here, the concentration of human bodies was overwhelming. Whole families, sometimes several unrelated families, were packed into a single dark room, pooling their body heat in a losing battle against the penetrating damp. Privacy was as rare and unreachable as a chest of gold. The air itself felt heavy, loaded with the sticky smoke of sea coal, the sour tang of cheap beer, the rancid scent of unwashed flesh, and beneath it all a constant undertone of rot. What we would call sanitation simply did not exist. The streets served as open drains, with channels known as kennels running along their centre. Into these foul gutters flowed a primeval mixture of human and animal waste, kitchen refuse, offal, and sometimes the bloated remains of a stray dog or other unlucky creature. Privies overflowed routinely, their contents soaking into the ground and often seeping into the very wells and pumps from which people drew their drinking water. For rats, it was a paradise. For microbes, a vast, thriving empire. Nobody in St. Giles was startled when someone died. Death was not an occasional visitor, it was a permanent lodger next door. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis, these names, or their rougher contemporaries, made their relentless rounds. But in December of 1664, something shifted, quietly at first, like a faint new note in a familiar melancholy tune. A single death was recorded, then another. On paper they looked like all the rest. London's machinery for recording mortality had its own particular habits. The cause of death was decided by searchers, typically elderly, impoverished women of the parish, paid a few pence to peer at a corpse and name a reason. They possessed no medical schooling at all. Their conclusions rested on hearsay, old wives' tales, and what the grieving family wished them to write down. Those families had a powerful incentive to steer them away from one specific term. That word was plague. To have plague officially written beside a loved one's name was to trigger catastrophe. It meant the household would be locked up, trade halted, neighbours shunning them, and in many cases, the slow extinction of everyone under that roof. So when a man called Richard Andrews died in early December, and soon after his wife Rebecca followed him to the grave, their neighbours and the searchers alike carefully avoided that fatal label. Perhaps it was spotted fever, or ague, or some other more tolerable illness. Almost anything was preferable, yet to someone who knew the signs, the symptoms were deeply troubling. A burning fever, delirium, and most ominously, the painful swellings in the groin or under the arms, the buboes, the grim tokens of the Black Death. Throughout that winter, the sickness burned low and uncertain, like a candle flame flickering in a draught. There were a few more deaths in St. Giles and in nearby St. Clement Danes. Then, for some weeks, the record fell strangely silent. The deep, biting cold appeared to have smothered whatever it was. Life in all its dirty, noisy, bustling normality trudged on. Londoners who had a durable habit of optimism in the face of misfortune allowed themselves to believe the danger had passed. Perhaps they thought it had only been a false echo of older plagues, a spark that failed to catch. But the true cause of this illness, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, had not disappeared. It was only biding its time. It lay dormant inside its living hosts, waiting patiently for warmth, for the loosening of winter's grip, for spring. It travelled in the blood of black rats, the quick, elusive creatures that shared London's houses more intimately than most people realised, scrabbling in the walls, scurrying through roof spaces, nesting in cellars and granaries. A hidden army moving alongside the human city, mostly unseen. And on those rats, buried in their dark, greasy fur, rode the real cavalry of this microscopic apocalypse: the fleas. Over those quiet winter cases hovered one question, a question that would later be screamed in panic, but which at that time passed almost unnoticed. Where had this visitor come from? The disease was no native of English soil. Like so many fortunes and disasters that shaped London, it had come up the great river. It had sailed in on the Thames. The Thames was London's main artery, the great brown channel that connected it to the wider world. Its sluggish waters were perpetually jammed with a thicket of masts. Boats of every size and origin pressed along its length, from squat river barges to towering three-masted merchantmen heavy with cargo. East of the Tower of London sprawled the docks, a chaotic tumble of wharves, sheds, cranes, rickety stairways, warehouses, taverns, and lodging houses. It was there that silks from Persia, spices from the Indies, wines from France, and, crucial to our story, bales of cotton and finished cloth from the Low Countries were unloaded. In 1663 and 1664, Amsterdam, London's fierce commercial rival, had been devastated by an outbreak of bubonic plague. Tens of thousands died there. Even though political tensions between England and the Dutch Republic simmered and soon flared into the Second Anglo-Dutch War, trade never truly stopped. Profit, as so often, outweighed prudence. Dutch merchantmen kept nosing their way into the London docks, their holds stuffed with valuable goods. Among those goods, hidden deep in the shadows between sacks of grain and stacks of fabric, came stowaways that no customs officer could see. Black rats ratus were accomplished sailors. Ships offered shelter, food, and dark, undisturbed spaces in which to breed. With them, in their fur and among their whiskers, travelled their parasites. The fleas, Xenopsilla chaopes. The method by which these tiny creatures spread the plague was a masterpiece of lethal biology. A flea would sink its mouthparts into an infected rat, drawing up blood filled with Yersinia pestis. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria multiplied with frantic speed, forming a sticky plug that blocked the insect's digestive tract. Starving and frantic, the flea would attempt to feed again, biting repeatedly another rat if it could find one, or failing that, any warm-blooded host within reach. A dock laborer, a sailor, a child. Unable to swallow, the flea would vomit infected blood straight into the wound it had just bitten. With every bite, the bacteria were pushed into a fresh bloodstream. The engine of transmission was now turning. Historians believe that one or several such ships, probably tying up at the wharves of Rotherhithe or Stepney in the autumn of 1664, brought this invisible cargo to London. Once the mooring ropes were fastened and the gangplanks down, the infected rat, but now and then it crossed the barrier between species. A dock worker might complain of feeling off-chilly, flushed, aching. His family would blame the damp air from the river or a long day lifting barrels. Within days, he would be dead. His wife, who had sat up with him through sweating, delirious nights, would fall sick next. Then perhaps a neighbour who had stopped in to comfort them or to help lay out the corpse. Each death was a personal disaster, but still not enough to reveal a clear pattern. In the crowded, unhealthy parishes of the East End, people died all the time. Who would stop to notice that this particular fever was something different? The route from the riverside districts to St. Giles, further west, was unlikely to have been a neat, direct line. More probably it twisted and doubled back, carried in flea-ridden bundles of cloth piled on the wagons of rag and bone men, or simply creeping along with the slow migration of rats through riverside cellars, sewers, and interconnected foundations. When Rebecca Andrews died that December, hers was not the first life taken by the plague in London. It was simply the first time it killed someone in a parish where the authorities had begun to look a little more closely at what was happening. The enemy had long since crossed the boundary. It had spent months building a hidden foothold, quiet, unseen, patient. And with the coming of milder weather, it stood ready to strike in earnest. As the winter of 1664 softened into the wet, clinging spring of 1665, official denial hardened into an unspoken policy. City magistrates and wealthy merchants alike had far too much at stake to welcome panic. London's lifeblood was trade, and the word plague could choke that lifeblood overnight. The weekly printed lists of deaths, the bills of mortality continued to show increasing numbers, but the causes were comfortably vague: fever, flux, and similar useful labels. Meanwhile, among physicians, apothecaries, grave diggers, and those who saw bodies close up, uncomfortable whispers were beginning to stir. The signs were too familiar. By April and May, a new column in those bills, the line reserved for plague, which had long stood at 0, began to reveal small but persistent numbers. 1, 2, 8, 17. The little flame that had flickered through winter had been nursed back to life, and now the wind of spring was feeding it. By June, no one could reasonably pretend any longer. The sickness had burst out of St. Giles and was racing through nearby parishes: Holborn, the streets off Fleet Street, the twisting lanes around Drury Lane. In the first week of June, 43 deaths were officially attributed to plague. In the next, 112. Soon after, 168. And everyone understood, almost instinctively, that these figures were a soft echo of a far larger truth. The dread that magistrates had been desperate to keep at bay took firm hold of the city. Those who could escape began to do so. Wealthy households made hurried preparations. King Charles II and his court laid plans to withdraw first to Hampton Court, then farther afield to Salisbury, and finally to Oxford if need be. Their decision was the signal many had been waiting for. Before long, roads leading out of London were jammed with carriages and wagons, piled high with trunks, beds, chests, and nervous occupants, all headed away from the doomed metropolis. Aristocrats, judges, bishops, well-heeled lawyers, and prosperous traders streamed out in a slow, anxious convoy. Those left behind, whether out of civic duty, lack of means, or simple resignation, found themselves under the authority of the city's civic leaders, headed by the Lord Mayor, Sir John Lawrence. Lawrence was a calm, determined figure who, unlike his monarch, chose to remain at his station. With the aldermen and the Court of Common Council beside him, he faced a colossal challenge. To control an epidemic he did not truly comprehend, using tools forged in earlier outbreaks that were crude at best, and often lethal in their consequences. The backbone of their strategy was a set of regulations called the Plague Orders. These were not newly invented. They were enlarged and revised versions of measures drawn up during earlier plagues, notably that of 1630. They were founded on the then-dominant miasmatic theory, the belief that plague spread through corrupt, poisonous air. But in practice, their main focus was not cleanliness, it was containment. Their central principle was brutally simple: isolate the sick and everyone who lived with them. The cornerstone of the Lord Mayor's policy was household quarantine. When someone in a dwelling was pronounced to have plague, the response was not to remove that individual, but to seal the entire house. The sick, their spouses, children, servants, lodgers, every soul under that roof was trapped together. The front door was nailed shut or locked from the outside. On it, a parish official painted a tall red cross, and beside it, in large letters, the plea that would come to define the suffering of that summer: "Lord, have mercy upon us." To enforce this mass imprisonment, guards known as watchmen were appointed. One stood at each sealed house, day and night. His job was to see that nobody slipped out, and no unauthorized person entered. He was also the family's only permitted link to the world beyond, charged with buying and delivering whatever food or supplies they needed, leaving them at the threshold. These men were drafted from among the poorer citizens and paid a meager wage for work fraught with danger. Constantly exposed to infection, they were also easy targets for the distrust and resentment of neighbors. Corruption under such strain was inevitable. A watchman might be persuaded for a bribe to look the other way, while a healthy but desperate prisoner slipped out and fled, taking perhaps the infection along. In essence, to be shut up in this way was a sentence of slow execution. By enclosing both sick and well together inside small, dark, badly ventilated dwellings, the authorities had unwittingly turned those homes into perfect brood chambers for the disease. A house marked with the Red Cross became an object of mingled pity and fear. Those who passed in the street glanced at it with the grim knowledge that few, if any, within would live to see it opened again. Years later, the writer Daniel Defoe, in his semi-fictional but finely researched Journal of the Plague Year, captured the hysteria this method produced. The screams from barred windows, the frantic attempts to break free, the madness that seized whole households as they waited in turn for death. Alongside these quarantines, the Lord Mayor's orders sought to reshape public life to curb contagion. All communal gatherings were forbidden. The theatres, recently the beating heart of restoration culture, were darkened. Bear baiting, bull baiting, and other raucous entertainments were stopped. Taverns and alehouses were told to limit the number of drinkers and to prevent rowdy, crowded scenes. Funerals were to be carried out by night, with no processions of mourners, in hopes of avoiding daytime crowds. Various efforts were made to purify the city based on contemporary ideas about bad air. Household fronts were to be swept daily. Enormous bonfires were built in streets and at major crossroads, fed with tar and pungent materials to fumigate the air. One of the most tragic and counterproductive measures focused on household animals. Convinced that dogs and cats spread the plague, the Lord Mayor ordered them destroyed. Men were hired specifically to patrol the streets, dispatching any they found. By some estimates, around 40,000 dogs and 200,000 cats were killed. The result was disastrous. In ridding the city of its main rat hunters, the authorities unconsciously gave the rodent population, the true reservoir of the disease, freedom to multiply unchecked. The plague's army was not merely left alone, it was given room to swell. To manage all this, a wide apparatus of officials had to be assembled. Each parish was split into smaller districts, with examiners assigned to each. Their duty was to investigate any suspicious illness or death and report their findings. If plague seemed likely, the searchers came next to confirm it. Then the constable was informed. He would order the house sealed and a watchman posted. It was an attempt to impose bureaucratic order on natural chaos, to turn waves of sickness into columns of ink on a page. But as summer advanced and the weekly death toll climbed from hundreds into thousands, this system strained and began to crack. The repeated percussion of hammers sealing doors became part of London's everyday sounds, alongside the relentless toll of church bells and the rumbling of carts that carried the dead away after dark. Watchmen at their posts, glowering red crosses, heaps of burning tar in the roads. All these combined to turn London into a waking nightmare. The Lord Mayor's directives, though motivated by duty and backed by the best medical wisdom of their era, did not halt the rising tide. At best, they directed its flow. The city was now a vast prison, and the plague was its implacable warden. The machine of containment was running, but the true ordeal, the blistering, deadly height of the summer, still lay ahead. The Great Visitation, as some grimly called it, had declared itself, and it had come to stay. By the spring of 1665, fear was no longer a faint rumor drifting along the wharves. It had become a silent, suffocating presence in the very heart of London, and with fear came calculation. For men and women of means, those who owned coaches, estates, and country retreats, life and death seemed to divide neatly along a single line. London meant danger. The countryside meant, or appeared to mean, safety. The departure of the wealthy did not begin as a wild stampede, but as a discreet, almost stealthy withdrawal from the city's core. First to lead the way, as always, was the king. Charles II, a man well practiced in the art of survival, was not about to wait until the plague reached the royal walls at Whitehall. In early July, as the temperature climbed and the weekly death counts climbed with it, the royal household began to move. Carriages loaded with paintings, tapestries, trunks of silverware, clothing, and uneasy courtiers rattled westward over the cobbles, bound first for the relative refuge of Hampton Court, then farther still toward Salisbury and Oxford. There the king set up a temporary court in exile, far from the fouled air of his stricken capital. Others quickly followed his example. Noble families, judges, senior clergy, influential lawyers, and prosperous merchants retreated behind them. It was a carefully organized evacuation of rank and money. The grand townhouses along the Strand and in Covent Garden were shuttered windows boarded, fine furniture draped in dust sheets. A skeleton staff of servants, usually the least privileged and most easily sacrificed, stayed behind to keep watch over the deserted properties. The streets that had once echoed with the noise of fine carriages, pages running errands, and the busy murmur of fashionable society began to fall eerily quiet. Luxury shops that had catered to noble tastes, selling lace, ribbons, jewels, and perfumed gloves, drew down their shutters. Their owners packed up what they could and fled as well. It was as though the lifeblood of London was draining silently away, leaving the skeleton of the city exposed, pale, hollow-eyed, and unsteady. Leaving, however, was not simple, even for the fortunate. Terror spread faster than the contagion itself. Towns and villages around London, convinced that refugees from the capital would bring the plague with them, set up their own defences watches on roads, barricades, and local decrees barring entry. Officially, anyone wishing to pass had to show a certificate of health, a document issued by the Lord Mayor confirming that the bearer and household came from a parish officially free of infection. On paper, this was an early form of health passport, meant to balance movement with public safety. In practice, it became yet another system bent by influence and coin. Certificates were forged with crude but effective skill. Bribes eased the path of many a carriage. Guards at the city gates, faced with a richly appointed coach bearing a recognizable coat of arms, could suddenly discover new flexibility in the rules. For most of London's roughly 400,000 inhabitants, though, escape was a dream with no substance. They were artisans, apprentices, day labourers, maids, street hawkers, dock hands, porters, and clerks. Their lives were woven into the streets and alleys of London. Their livelihoods depended on being exactly where the danger was. There was no country manor waiting to receive them, no distant cousins ready to offer a wing of their house. If they had savings, they were slim barely enough for a short journey, certainly not enough to live on for months among strangers who feared them. They were trapped. Trapped by poverty, trapped by the necessity of working until the last moment, and trapped by a system that now demanded a certificate of health, which for them was almost impossible to obtain. No money for bribes, no influential acquaintances. A coughing labourer was immediately suspect. A feverish nobleman was politely described as indisposed. Thus, London broke in two. One city was a phantom landscape of locked mansions and abandoned counting houses. The other, layered directly over it, was an enormous open-air prison, overflowing and terrified. The outer parishes, Stepney, Whitechapel, Clerkenwell, crowded with the poor in sagging tenements and crooked lanes, became the disease's main strongholds. Here people slept, cooked, and worked almost on top of one another, sharing water sources, latrines, and unknowingly the fleas that carried Yersinia pestis. The flight of the wealthy had a devastating ripple effect. It robbed the poor of their customers and employers. With the gentry gone, tailors had no one to commission new suits. Cobblers had no fine boots to make or mend. Wig makers had no heads worth adorning. Merchants leaving the city meant ships sat unloaded, warehouses idle, dock workers standing around with nothing to do. As the plague advanced, hunger crept in beside it. For the poor, the choice often became brutally simple: risk infection to seek work or stay home and slowly starve. Sir John Lawrence and the aldermen, to their credit, did not follow the general flight. They remained in the city, trying to maintain some grip on order, to arrange the collection and burial of the dead, and to distribute what little aid they could gather to people sinking into misery. Still, this was a skeletal government attempting to administer a city gasping for breath. The streets that had once thrummed with crowds, with gossip, arguments, bargaining, and laughter, now held only those who had no way out, those too sick to move, and those who clung to their responsibilities out of principle or habit. London was now a gigantic snare, and for hundreds of thousands of its citizens, the trap had sprung shut. Within this suffocating environment, hope itself turned into a scarce commodity. With official measures failing and traditional structures crumbling, people turned, as they always do, in extremity to the healers, the wise, the supposed experts. But 17th century medicine, faced with bubonic plague, was like a child with a toy sword confronting a tidal wave. It relied almost entirely on ancient theories, chiefly those of Galen, a Greek physician from the 2nd century. According to him, the human body was governed by 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on the correct balance of these fluids. Illness stemmed from an imbalance. This framework underpinned most treatments. Yet for plague, an even older and more simplistic notion held sway: miasma theory. It taught that disease was born from miasmata, poisonous clouds of foul air, rising from decaying matter, damp ground, and corpses. Under this view, plague was not truly something passed directly between people. It was a haze of corruption in the air itself, inhaled along with every breath. This assumption dictated almost every official measure and private remedy. If the air was tainted, then the solution was to cleanse or counteract that air. City officials ordered bonfires to be lit along streets and at intersections, burning throughout the day and into the night, flooding neighborhoods with thick, acrid smoke from wood, pitch, and resin. Inside homes, families burned any pungent substance they could obtain: juniper branches, rosemary, frankincense, sulfur. People carried small metal spheres called pomanders, perforated balls packed with cloves, nutmeg, ambergris, and other costly aromatics. They held these to their nose whenever they stepped outdoors or encountered strangers. Ironically, the smoke and intense smells may indeed have deterred fleas to some degree, but for reasons no one then suspected. It was believed that the fragrance itself pushed away the invisible poison in the air, not that it might be driving off the actual vectors of infection. Into this mist of fear and misunderstanding stepped an unforgettable figure: the plague doctor. We tend to think of his strange appearance, the beaked mask, the long coat, as something from a costume shop or an old woodcut. In reality, it was an earnest attempt at protective clothing based entirely on the miasma theory. Picture him, a man sheathed from head to foot in a long garment of leather or waxed fabric, intended to present a smooth, non-absorbent surface that deadly vapors could not cling to. He wore thick gloves, heavy boots, and a broad-brimmed hat, sometimes also made of leather. But the most disturbing feature was the mask. A rigid bird-like face with round glass lenses for eyes and a long curved beak protruding several inches. That beak was more than a grotesque flourish. It was designed to act as a primitive respirator. Stuffed inside it was a dense mixture of strong-smelling herbs and spices: mint, cloves, camphor, laudanum, and other ingredients, sometimes soaked in vinegar. When they did attempt cures, the methods were harsh and more often than not, harmful. Operating within the humoral framework, the standard response to almost any serious illness began with bloodletting. A vein might be opened with a lancet, or leeches applied, in hopes of draining away corrupt humors. For the excruciating swellings, the buboes in the groin, armpits, or neck, the procedure was to lance them. A blade sliced into the lymph node to release pus, after which poultices of various mixtures were laid over the wound. These might include bread and milk, herbs, roasted onions, or in some cases bizarre substances such as pigeon droppings, all thought to draw out poison. Such treatments, carried out in filthy conditions and on bodies already weakened by infection and fever, frequently pushed patients closer to the grave rather than saving them. Wounds became further infected. There was a brisk trade in powdered unicorn horn, which was usually ground narwhal tusk sold at ruinous prices. One of the strangest recommended procedures involved plucking the feathers from the rear of a live hen and pressing the bare skin of the bird directly onto a bubo. The hen, it was claimed, would absorb the illness and die in the patient's place. If the bird survived, it was blamed on improper technique. Tobacco, still a relatively new arrival from the Americas, was enthusiastically hailed as a powerful defense. Smoke, people believed, cleared or dried the air in the lungs. Men, women, and children were urged to smoke pipes or to hold burning tobacco under the nose. At Eton College, it was said that boys were punished if they were found without their pipes during the worst of the plague. Frauds abounded. Some sold colored liquids in glass bottles on street corners, promising that a few drops would guarantee survival. Others offered amulets inscribed with prayers, mystical symbols, or fragments of scripture, marketing them as spiritual armor against divine wrath. The people, facing a threat they could not see or properly name, clutched at anything. They swallowed bitter draughts, wore charms hidden under their clothes, filled their lungs with tobacco fumes, all in the hope of persuading fate to spare them. Medicine, as we understand it, did not yet exist. There was no concept of bacteria, no clear notion of contagion, no clinical trials, no sterile instruments. There was only a stew of tradition, piety, speculation, and guesswork. Against the merciless efficiency of Yersinia pestis, these measures were little stronger than whispered incantations in a locked room. But what did life under such conditions actually feel like? What was it to walk those thinning streets, to breathe air thickened by smoke and fear, to watch a city unravel day by day? For this, we turn not to official decrees or medical treatises, but to the private, painstaking record of one man. Samuel Pepys. Pepys was no grand figure of state, no famous scientist or general. He was something far more precious to posterity, a tireless noticer. As clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board, he occupied a mid-level position in the machinery of government. His working days were filled with budgets, contracts, and supplies. But in his private diary, written in a personal shorthand only he could read, he chronicled his own life and the events around him with obsessive detail and disarming honesty. The diary was never meant for the public eye. That is precisely why it feels so raw and authentic. Through his words, we witness the plague not from a historian's distant vantage, but as a living experience, day by day. In late April 1665, he first mentions the plague almost in passing news of an infected house somewhere in Drury Lane. By May, his tone darkens. He notes that the plague is much in the town. The threat is beginning to move from rumor to reality. On June 7th, it comes into direct view. Pepys records going through Drury Lane and seeing for the first time houses marked with red crosses and the dreaded words, "Lord have mercy upon us," painted on their doors. The emblem of official quarantine, which he had heard about from others, now confronts him in person. Even now, reading across centuries, one can sense the shock in his calm, methodical prose. Like most people with something to lose, Pepys was first and foremost concerned for his family. In early July, he made the painful decision to send his wife Elizabeth, his mother, and most of their servants away from London to Woolwich. where the Navy Board had facilities and where it was thought they would be safer. He remained in their house on Seething Lane near the Tower, accompanied only by a few essential staff. His position in the Navy administration, especially with England at war with the Dutch, was too critical to abandon. From that moment, his diary toggles between two worlds. In one, the routines of naval business limp on. Shipbuilding, pay disputes, provisioning, arguments with contractors. In the other, he describes his attempts to navigate a city under siege by disease. His entries from August and September, the peak months of death, are especially haunting. He writes of the dead silence of formerly busy avenues. On August 16th, he notes that on a warm day, he could scarcely see 20 people walking in areas that would once have been thronged. He remarks, astonished, that grass had begun to sprout in the neglected streets near Whitehall. The only continuous sounds, he says, are the endless tolling of church bells, ringing for each death and at night. The creaking wheels and iron-shod clatter of the death carts making their rounds, accompanied by the grim cry to bring out the dead. Pepys, naturally sociable, fond of theatre, music, and lively company in taverns, found himself increasingly withdrawn. He became almost superstitiously cautious. In his diary, he frets about handling money and letters, worrying they might carry contagion. Though he disliked tobacco, he bought some and chewed it in the belief it might protect him, complaining in his notes that it left him feeling unwell even as he forced himself to use it. Yet duty compelled him to move through the city. On his trips, he encountered scenes of intimate tragedy that statistics could never convey. Once, rowing on the Thames, he noticed a lone waterman sobbing uncontrollably. The man had lost his entire family to the plague. On another day, walking to a meeting, he saw a man carrying the small, bundled body of his own child through the street, bearing it himself to a burial pit because he lacked the money for a coffin or for hired bearers. Moments like these fill the diary, transforming abstract numbers into sharply etched human stories. At the same time, Pepys did not become a saint or an ascetic. He continued to worry about promotions, to bargain over his income, to fuss about his wine cellar and his collection of books. He still noticed a well-dressed woman or savored an especially good dinner. It is this mixture mundane self-interest alongside genuine horror that makes his record so compelling. It reminds us that even in catastrophic times, life continues in tiny, self-absorbed ways until it doesn't. Pepys is also candid about his own contradictions. At times, he behaves bravely, appearing at the Navy office when almost all his colleagues have fled, ensuring that the war effort, however stuttering, does not collapse. At other times, he confesses to panicked retreats when he sees someone on the street who looks ill. In early September, fearing he might die, he composed his will, anxious to put his affairs in order. A man, he wrote, cannot be too well prepared for death. In the end, he survived. As the weather cooled and autumn stole over the city, the number of weekly deaths slowly, then more sharply, declined. In October, he records with relief that the plague is abating mightily. The exodus of the wealthy slowly reversed. Coaches began to arrive instead of depart. By winter, the unending toll of bells eased. The death carts rolled less often. The cry that had haunted the streets at night grew rare, then stopped. Through Samuel Pepys's eyes, we don't merely trace a timeline of events. We feel the emotional arc, the creeping dread, the crushing peak, and the hesitant, fragile release. His pages give us not just a record of a city skirting annihilation, but a portrait of one ordinary man's anxious, flawed, and stubborn effort to keep living, working, and writing while death pressed in on every side. As July surrendered to a suffocating heat, London seemed to start choking on its own air. The atmosphere, already dense with coal smoke and the stench rising from the Thames, took on an almost physical heaviness, thick not only with humidity, but with an unspoken, all-pervading dread. What had begun in spring as a slow departure of the privileged had become, by high summer, a frantic rush of anyone with the slightest means to escape. But for the multitudes who remained penned in by poverty, duty, or fatalistic acceptance, their world shrank. First, it narrowed to the boundaries of their parish, then to their own street, and finally to the walls of their home, especially if those walls were marked with a red cross. It was the beginning of Thailand's, a descent into a numerical hell recorded in cold, regular figures each Thursday by the worshipful company of parish clerks. Those printed sheets were called the Bills of Mortality. Created a century earlier as an early warning system for outbreaks, the bills had evolved into something darker, the weekly heartbeat of London's suffering. Every week, clerks in each of the roughly 130 parishes gathered reports of burials and their supposed causes. The searchers, those elderly women, hardened by necessity or convinced of their own immunity, trudged from house to house to inspect the dead and decide what to write on the line marked "Cause of Death." Their often hasty guesses, refined or distorted by grieving families, traveled up the chain of record-keeping until each Thursday they were printed together in a single broadsheet. At first, Londoners had read these sheets with a morbid sort of curiosity, tracing the march of the plague the same way one might follow an invading army's movements on a map. But by July 1665, the army was no longer distant. It was camped in every neighborhood. Reading the bills became an act of ritualized fear. In the week that ended on July 18th, the figure for plague deaths suddenly leapt to 1,089. The next week, it rose to 1,843. By the final week of July, the number printed on the grim line for plague stood at 2,010. And to nearly everyone who could add and think, it was obvious that these totals were far below the truth. Searchers could be bribed with a coin or two or a bit of gin to record a death as consumption or spotted fever instead of plague, which would spare a family from having their house sealed. Religious groups such as Quakers often buried their own dead quietly, without passing through the official system, avoiding both scrutiny and statistics. Even some parish officials, reluctant to have their districts appear more diseased than others, eased their numbers. The real count was like a huge shadow cast behind the smaller silhouette printed on the page. August brought no reprieve. The heat lingered, oppressive and stagnant. Clouds seemed to hang low and sullen over the rooftops. The noise of London had dwindled. Street sellers no longer shouted their wares. Workshops, this little private ritual, a kind of scented armor against what he could not see, was shared by thousands who believed the sharpness of the smoke might fend off the invisible threat. The bills of mortality for August charted a ruinous escalation. In the first full week, more than 3,000 people were listed as dead from plague. The next, over 4,000. By the end of the month, the weekly count climbed beyond 6,000. The outer parishes, the districts outside the old Roman city walls, bore the brunt of this onslaught. Stepney, Holborn, Cripplegate, Southwark, each a maze of close-set houses, shared courtyards and flimsy tenements packed with the very poor. There the plague tore through crowded households like fire through dry thatch. Back in St. Giles in the Fields, where the first ominous deaths had occurred the previous winter, matters became almost unmanageable. The parish's ability to keep registers, to count and record, simply disintegrated under the weight of so many burials. Those still healthy enough were too absorbed in their own struggles or too frightened to worry about accurate paperwork. The administrative machinery that had seemed so ordered, searchers, clerks, printed lists, creaked and gave way. Then September arrived. If July could be described as a month of growing fear and August as a month of despair, September was a plunge into the abyss. The plague, now burning freely through every social and physical barrier, raged with a ferocity that stretched belief. The week containing September 19th brought the highest recorded toll. That Thursday's bill reported 7,165 deaths officially attributed to plague. The overall number of deaths from all causes stood at 8,297. Try to picture that. In a city whose original population had already been greatly reduced, many fled, many already buried, that meant more than 1,000 people dying every single day, about one every 90 seconds. Entire streets were quietly hollowed out, house by house. Sir John Lawrence, still at his post, issued order after order. More quarantines, stricter rules, renewed attempts at street cleaning and fumigation. But it was like trying to dam a tidal wave with sacks of sand. The plague no longer needed help from human folly. It had gained enough momentum to smash through defenses on its own. In the emptier streets of the central city, weeds sprouted between stones that had not seen proper sweeping or traffic for months. Many doors bore the Red Cross and its desperate invocation to divine mercy. Houses without such marks were now the exceptions. Pepys observed that the only people he frequently saw out and about were doctors, clergy, and those engaged in touching, carrying, or burying the dead. London itself had been transformed into an enormous infirmary, an improvised hospital with almost no staff and too few beds, where every family was both patient and caretaker, physician and undertaker. The sheer volume of mortality overwhelmed not only hearts and minds, but also the practical capacity of the city to cope with its own dead. 7,000 corpses each week. They asked the family a few rapid questions. On that basis, they pronounced their verdict, took their small payment, and moved on to the next house, each visit another wager with their own lives. Once the cause was declared and noted, the parish clerk added another line to his rough list. Eventually that list fed into the central bills of mortality, but the entry in ink did not move the body itself. That responsibility still lay inside the house, at least until nightfall. By law and custom, plague corpses could not be brought out during the day. It was believed that the sun's heat, falling on dead flesh, would stir up dangerous vapors and spread the infection more widely. The living therefore had to endure a terrible vigil, sometimes keeping watch over the body for many hours, waiting for darkness and what they knew would follow it. At dusk, the sound came, at first distant, then nearer, the shrill squeak of unoiled wheels, the dull rhythm of hooves, and finally the shout callous, uninflected, echoing off stone and timber. Bring out your dead. These were the corpse bearers and cart drivers, men. The carts themselves were stark and brutal, open wooden wagons, often farm vehicles seized for the purpose, pulled by a single weary horse. As the night progressed, the dead were stacked inside men, women, infants' limbs and torsos pressed together, faces turned in every direction. The drivers and bearers became, in a sense, the city's carron ferrying bodies, not souls from houses of the living to pits of the dead. As the epidemic intensified, one cart per parish was no longer enough. Multiple wagons rumbled through some districts each night, working without pause to clear the houses before morning. The destination of these bleak processions was perhaps the most shocking departure from normal custom, the plague pits. Under usual circumstances, burials were solemn affairs. A church service, a coffin if one could be afforded, a grave in the parish yard with a name on a stone, or at least remembered in the register. Even the poor expected, and usually received, some residue of dignity at the end. But during the height of the plague, there were far too many dead for such courtesies. Parish churchyards filled in weeks. Wood for coffins was scarce. Grave diggers were overrun. Clergy could not possibly recite funeral liturgies over each individual grave. So massive trenches were dug sometimes in the existing churchyards, sometimes on pieces of unused land on the fringe of the city. These rectangular cuts in the earth, known as plague pits, were deep and wide, their sides roughly shored up, their floors awaiting nightly deliveries. One of the largest and most notorious lay at Aldgate, in the burial ground of St. Botolph's parish. Defoe, drawing on eyewitness memories, described it as about 40 feet in length, 16 wide, and down as far as 20 feet. Night after night, the dead carts from neighboring parishes would queue up there or at similar pits. The bearers, armed with long poles and hooks, dragged bodies from the wagons and tumbled them into the darkness below. There were no names spoken, no prayers beyond what might be murmured privately. Only the thud of bodies striking the bottom or falling upon earlier layers, the scrape of shovels and the muttered curses of exhausted men. Once the pit's floor was covered with corpses, a layer of earth was thrown over them, sometimes mixed with quicklime, a caustic powder believed to hasten decay and purify the air. When the next night came, another stratum of bodies was added. so the pit slowly filled, layer upon layer, until it reached near the surface and had to be sealed, perhaps with a simple wooden fence or mound, to deter both animals and the horrified gaze of the living. One sexton later recalled that in a single night at the Aldgate pit, his crew interred 1,114 bodies. So many were going in that the pile of excavated soil beside the trench became a small hill by day, only to shrink again each night as more earth was scraped back in over new arrivals. These pits were more than physical scars on the city's ground. They were wounds in its mind. To be buried in a common anonymous trench was, to many, a spiritual nightmare, almost as dreadful as the illness. The thought that all distinctions of class, family, and identity might vanish in a jumble of limbs at the bottom of a pit haunted the imagination. For those who survived, such places remained for years points of dread and whispered stories. When the structures of daily existence collapse so completely, when work, law, ordinary social contact, even the expected rituals of mourning fall away, people are forced to seek new anchors. In London in 1665, the crisis was not only physical, it was psychological and spiritual at a level the city had never known. Two forces came to rule people's inner lives, knotted together in strange ways: fear and faith. Fear was pervasive, more penetrating even than the stink of refuse or the smoke from constant fires. It was the raw animal fear of unseen, imminent death. But it also took more complex forms. Suspicion seeped into every interaction. A neighbor's cough could feel like an attack. A friend's absence of a few days was quietly interpreted as a likely death. A loaf of bread bought from the wrong hands might be imagined as a fatal mistake. People edged away from each other in the street. Greetings became brief nods from a distance, if they happened at all. Every other human being now appeared as a possible source of destruction. In such an atmosphere, panic demanded culprits. The city sought faces to blame. Initially, animals bore the brunt. Acting on their mistaken belief about dogs and cats, the authorities had already ordered their culling, with the tragic consequences we have seen for rat populations. Suspicion then shifted to outsiders. Foreigners, especially the Dutch and the French, England's maritime rivals and enemies, were accused in rumours of poisoning wells or deliberately bringing plague-tainted goods into the city. Some were taunted, others attacked, and many lived under a cloud of hostility they had nothing to do with earning. But the deepest and most enduring blame turned inward and upward. In the 17th century Christian worldview, large disasters were not random. Many saw the plague as a direct message from God, a chastisement for London's sins. The capital, with its theatres, gambling dens, brothels, and fussy religious quarrels, was often likened to a modern Sodom. The pestilence, in this telling, became God's scourge, striking a city grown too corrupt. Prophets and fanatics, who in quieter times might have been mocked or ignored, suddenly found eager listeners. They went about crying of impending judgment, of visions, of cities burned or swallowed, calling everyone to urgent repentance. One such figure, Solomon Eagle, was said to wander the streets naked, carrying a pan of burning coals on his head, shouting, "Woe, woe to this city!" His wild theatrics became part of the city's uncanny landscape. If God's anger could bring the plague, then perhaps God's mercy might end it. Many residents, even those not particularly devout before, turned intensely toward religion. Here again, the relentless logic of contagion collided with human need. Anglican clergy from wealthier parishes had often fled with their patrons. But many parish priests and numerous dissenting ministers stayed, convinced that abandoning their congregations in their hour of need was a betrayal too great. Their churches filled with frightened worshippers, desperate for meaning or comfort. Ironically, those crowded services, dark, hot, saturated with the breath of hundreds pressed together, became perfect environments for plague transmission. People came to pray for protection and unknowingly exposed themselves to greater danger. Imagine a Sunday gathering in a church such as St. Giles, Cripplegate. The pews jammed, the air thick and warm, smells of sweat, incense, damp clothing. Voices respond to the minister's sonorous words about God's wrath, God's mercy, the transience of earthly life. Somewhere in that crowd are people already in the early stages of infection, their bodies harboring the bacteria, their clothes harboring the fleas. The sermon, meant to save souls, inadvertently helped the disease find fresh victims. Yet the services did not stop. The fear of dying without spiritual preparation was, for many, as frightening as the disease itself. People clung to prayer, to confession, to psalms and exhortations, as though repeating those words might weave a small shield between them and the advancing darkness. With many official pulpits empty, dissenting preachers, Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, independent ministers, stepped into the gap. These men had often been silenced or pushed to the margins after the restoration of Charles II. Now, with the established clergy largely gone, they began speaking in the streets, in private houses, or in such churches as they could access. To many of the poor, who felt abandoned by both state and established church, these preachers became heroes, walking fearlessly among the sick, offering words of consolation and warning in equal measure. One, Thomas Vincent, a Presbyterian minister, became especially noted for his fiery sermons and for refusing to leave the city despite grave personal risk. In his writings, he described the scenes of devastation and his attempts to direct people's thoughts toward eternity as their earthly prospects crumbled. So London became a stage on which fear and faith performed a strange dance. In one house, a family filled their doorway with charms and herbs, distrusting every passerby as a possible curse. In the next, people knelt together in near constant prayer, rehearsing their confessions and commending their souls to God. In the street outside, the dead cart rolled by, indifferent to both houses alike. Those twin forces paralyzing terror and fervent belief were, in their way, both attempts at control. Fear tried to create rules: do not touch, do not visit, do not stand too near. Faith supplied a narrative: this suffering has a reason. Endure it rightly, and you will be rewarded. But to the plague bacillus, these inner dramas meant nothing. It moved from host to host, according to the laws of chance and biology, answering only to temperature, opportunity, and the tiny jaws of starving fleas. As August wore on, that interplay of fear, faith, despair, and stubborn daily habit formed the fabric of life for those who remained. And within the cramped, sealed houses of London, people developed their own small rituals of survival rituals made of vinegar, smoke, hot water, and watchful eyes. As the August sun burned overhead, turning the sluggish Thames into a band of gleaming, foul-smelling vapor, day-to-day existence, for those imprisoned in the city, narrowed to a set of painstaking routines, a choreography of caution repeated in tight, airless rooms. The great story of the plague, the king's departure, the weekly bills, the Lord Mayor's ordinances faded for many into a distant backdrop. Survival became a domestic craft, practiced hour by hour. At the center of this everyday struggle stood a simple, indispensable question: how to obtain food without inviting death into the house. Markets such as Leadenhall or Cheapside did not close completely, but they were stripped-down versions of themselves. Many local stallholders were dead, fled, or too afraid to appear. Instead, farmers and traders from surrounding counties often brought goods only to the city's fringes, dropping off cartloads of vegetables, grain, or meat at agreed meeting places, crossroads and open spaces outside the worst affected districts. From there, middlemen or the more daring Londoners would fetch the supplies. Such exchanges were wary, mechanical, and stripped of ordinary human warmth. Buying a joint of meat or a sack of oats now felt like negotiating with fate. Money itself became an object of fear. Coins passed through countless hands and pockets. Few doubted that they might be tainted. The solution was as simple as it was imprecise: vinegar. Sellers and buyers used bowls or pots filled with it as makeshift disinfectant basins. A buyer would drop the payment into the pungent liquid, sloshing it about before the seller fished the coins out with tongs or gloved fingers. The belief was that the acid would strip away the plague. It did nothing to the bacteria hidden in fleas, but it spoke to a dawning instinctive understanding that some things could carry disease from place to place. For those with some comfort left a small store of money, a few servants, the most dangerous errands were delegated. A boy, a maid, or a junior servant might be sent to the market with a list and a purse of coins. This person became the vulnerable hinge in the household's chain of defense. On their return, a ritual unfolded on the doorstep. The servant was not permitted to cross into the main room straight away. First, they were ordered to remove their outer clothes, sometimes in the yard or entrance passage, and wash themselves as best they could with water laced with vinegar or strong herbs. Fresh garments, set aside in advance, were handed to them. The parcels they carried, bread, vegetables, meat, candles, soap, were all treated with suspicion. Bread might be held quickly over the flame of a candle or fire to purify it. Greens were rinsed and rinsed again. Cloth sacks were shaken out or left outdoors. Their old clothes were boiled if possible, or hung out for days in wind and sunlight. Households that lacked servants had no such buffer. The head of the family, or whichever member was youngest, a distant cough could cause footsteps to quicken. A sudden sneeze might make bystanders scatter. Within the home, forced closeness bred its own torments. Official shutting up of infected houses, locking in everyone, sick or healthy, for weeks was the worst nightmare. But even self-imposed isolation, in households not yet marked by a red cross, carried heavy strains. Rooms were small, often low-ceilinged and barely lit. Families paused repeatedly to peer through cracks in shutters at the oddly quiet street beyond. The monotonous days were broken mainly by one set of sounds, the distant clanging of church bells and the closer clatter of the death carts. The cry of "Bring out your dead" became the recurring refrain of the city's life, the signal that the thin walls were all that separated one household from joining the procession. At first, the carts might pass once, slept and waited in these spaces, with few distractions beyond work that could be done indoors. Every twinge was suspect. A chill at night, a headache in the morning, a dry throat. Any small change sent waves of panic through the room. People scrutinized each other's faces and hands for signs of swelling with the intensity of interrogators. Parents watched their children with double vision, love tangled with fear. To press a hand to a hot forehead was to face the possibility that the entire household would soon be destined not for the churchyard, but for a nameless pit. Even one's own body became an object of watchfulness and dread. Time itself slowed and thickened. People started to mark the advance or retreat of the disease by how often those wheels could be heard rattling outside. An hour's silence seemed almost a blessing. Within this pressure cooker environment, the usual social order began to distort and crack. With the king, court, many magistrates, judges, senior clergy, and wealthy merchants gone, a vacuum of authority opened. London became a city under siege from an unseen assailant, and in such sieges the rules that once bound behavior together loosen and sometimes snap. Crime flourished like mold in a damp cellar. Burglary and looting, always present, now thrived. Houses marked with the Red Cross were especially tempting. Thieves guessed, often correctly, that most or all inside were either too sick to resist or already dead. Under cover of darkness, they broke doors, smashed locks, and stripped the interiors of anything they could carry. Silver plate, jewelry, good clothing, bedding, even windows and floorboards in some cases. There were few effective officers left to confront them. Constables who remained on duty had more than enough to do enforcing quarantines, organizing night watches, and assisting with burials. The law's reach, never very long in the best of times, shrank dramatically. Even some of those officially tasked with managing the dead could not resist temptation. Searchers were rumored to empty pockets and pull off rings before recording deaths. Cart drivers and bearers were known to pilfer clothing, shoes, or any visible valuables. When death was everywhere, the extra risk of thievery perhaps seemed small to them. One particular figure drew a cloud of infamy: the plague nurse. In theory, these were women employed by parishes or hired by families to tend the sick in shut-up houses, bringing food, cleaning, administering whatever remedies were prescribed and offering basic comfort. In reality, with so little oversight possible and so many desperate people available, the role sometimes attracted ruthless opportunists. Locked in a house with a dying family, such a nurse held near absolute power. Stories circulated of nurses who neglected to feed or clean their patients, leaving them to weaken and die faster, then helping themselves liberally to their belongings. Darker tales accused some of actively hastening death-smothering sufferers with pillows, overdosing them on sleeping draughts, or delivering remedies that were more lethal than any disease. Whether every such story was true is impossible to know, but the fear they generated was real enough. To place your loved one's care in the hands of a stranger who might in fact be waiting like a vulture was a terror layered on top of plague itself. The city also crawled with healers of another sort, quacks selling miracle cures, astrologers drawing horoscopes for a fee, cunning folk offering charms and spells. Bottles of colored liquids, bundles of dried roots, papers covered in odd symbols, they changed hands for outrageous sums. In a time, tax revenues had plunged, businesses were closed or burned out. To pay for the city's emergency services, Lawrence and other prosperous citizens dipped into their own purses and canvassed absentee nobles and merchants for donations. Out of these funds, however modest, came the wages that kept men willing to perform the most appalling tasks. The drivers of the dead carts, the pit diggers, the watchmen at shut-up doors. These men were the skeleton crew of a sinking ship. Most were poor, some chronically drunk, many rough or violent by nature. They were widely feared and even hated as bringers of contagion. But without them, bodies would have piled in doorways and alleys until the city choked on its own dead. Corruption stained this system inevitably. Watchmen were known to accept bribes to let people slip through sealed doors, undermining the entire logic of quarantine. Cart drivers skimmed coins or property whenever they could. Gravediggers sometimes worked drunk, but for all its flaws, the system held barely through the months when it was needed most. Alongside the paid officials were countless quiet acts of decency. Neighbors left food and drink on the doorsteps of shut-in houses. Some physicians of notable courage, such as Nathaniel Hodges, remained in the city, visiting the ill and recording what they observed, even as many of their colleagues vanished. Clergy, both Anglican and dissenting, risked their lives to bring the sacrament to dying parishioners or to conduct simple funerals where possible. Taken together, these acts of stubborn service, bureaucratic and personal, formed a fragile dike against total chaos. London in the summer of 1665 was certainly not a place of universal generosity and order. But neither was it a complete wasteland of cruelty. It was, like most human societies, under immense stress, a mixture of both, thieves and extortionists on one side, sacrificial officials and neighbors on the other. Still, by September, the strain seemed beyond what any structure could bear. The weekly bills of mortality, with their numbers cresting above 7,000 plague deaths, read like a final verdict. The smells of decay and smoke, intensified by the warm air, were so strong that people later said you could taste death on the wind. The plague pits yawned open, filling each night. Earth mounds around them grew, then shrank again as more graves were heaped shut. It felt as though the city had reached its absolute limit, that one more turn of the screw would break whatever remained of its endurance. And then, with no sudden miracle, no new drug or discovery, something began to shift. The air changed. The sun sank earlier. Even in the midst of ruin, autumn approached, bearing with it London's most unlikely savior, the cold. As September blurred into October, the evenings turned sharper. Breath began to mist in the air at dawn. Fires, once merely symbols in the street or tools of fumigation, became again what they had always been in winter comforts and necessities inside household hearths. The story of the plague. Others credited the endless bonfires and fumigations, convinced that the air was at last being cleansed. The real causes, hidden from them, lay not in incense or sermons, but in the minute dramas playing out in the bodies of rats and fleas as temperatures slid downward. Without knowing it, London was being saved by physics and biology. The Great Plague that had ravaged London was, at its core, a warm weather phenomenon. The bacterium Yersinia pestis flourished in certain conditions, and the small insect that most efficiently carried it, the oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chaopis, needed warmth to complete its life cycle at speed. In the height of summer, with temperatures comfortably above 10 or 12 degrees Celsius, the flea's world thrived. A single female might lay hundreds of eggs, which hatched into larvae and then matured into adults in just a few weeks. Once infected, the bacteria multiplied madly inside the flea's narrow gut, forming the deadly blockage that prevented it from feeding properly. Driven insane with hunger, it bit again and again, forcing infected blood back into each new wound. In subtle increments, every drop in the thermometer reduced the opportunities for the disease to pass from rat to flea to human. So when the first real frosts of November settled on London, painting the streets with a thin, glittering coat at dawn, the effect on the epidemic was decisive. The bills of mortality for November and December read like a slow exhalation after months of panicked inhaling. Where there had been thousands of plague deaths each week, there were now hundreds, then scores, then only a relative handful. For those still alive, this cooling of the city's fever felt almost unreal. Houses that had remained bolted for weeks began, gingerly, to open their shutters. Doors that had been locked from within for fear of neighbors now creaked, cautiously ajar. People stepped out into the weak winter light as though onto a foreign shore, blinking and uncertain. They stared at each other across the empty streets with a mingled wariness and kinship. Anyone they recognized was, by definition, a fellow survivor. Every face belonged to someone who had passed through what seemed like an impossible trial. A few stalls crept back into the markets, their owners hoping there were enough customers left to make business possible. Bakers relit their ovens. Shoemakers tested whether there were still living feet to wear their wares. Those who had fled earlier in the year now began to trickle back. Coaches rolled through city gates, not away from them. Some returning families found their houses looted or decayed. Others discovered neighbors gone, replaced by silence. Old patterns reasserted themselves, the pulling back of shutters each morning, the exchange of news across doorsteps, the slow reweaving of commerce and chatter. The fear did not vanish overnight. People flinched at a cough, eyed new arrivals with suspicion, and avoided close embraces. The few remaining red crosses were still viewed with something like horror. The plague had not disappeared entirely. New cases continued to flicker here and there through the winter. But its wildfire phase was over. What remained was smoldering embers, not the all-consuming blaze of summer. Joy was muted, overshadowed by grief and fatigue. Nearly everyone carried fresh scars. Some had lost a spouse, others a child or several children, some a whole household of relatives and friends. Memories of carts and bells, of the smell of tar and death, were too close for celebration. Still, for the first time in nearly a year, people could think beyond tomorrow with something other than dread. They could plan small things. Repairs, new apprenticeships, even marriages. Cold, which for so long had been only another hardship in hard lives, had become an unlikely guardian. It had done what no human strategy could accomplish. It had strangled the plague's momentum. The winter of 1665 into 1666 was therefore a time of uneasy reprieve, a pause in which losses were counted and the question of what came next hung over the city like the grey, low sky. The long freeze, by slowing the disease, had given London back to itself maimed, diminished, but alive. When that hard season finally began to loosen, and frost retreated from the fields of Finsbury and Moorfields, the city had to confront its own ledger. It needed to add up the human cost of what it had just endured. As early spring softened the ground and the first pale hints of green returned to the open spaces, London's officials, clerks and chroniclers looked to the same tool they had used throughout the crisis: the bills of mortality. These weekly lists had been used for years as a form of surveillance, telling Londoners and their leaders what diseases were in circulation and where. Now they were to serve another purpose, to give some shape to the emptiness that the plague had left behind. The bills were compiled under the supervision of the Worshipful Company of Parish Clerks, an organization of men entrusted with gathering and publishing information on births and deaths. In theory, their work provided a careful monthly and yearly record of the health of the city. In practice, particularly in the year of the plague, the system was riddled with inaccuracies, blind spots, and at times intentional deception. The process still began where it always had, in the cramped rooms where people were dying. The searchers of the dead, those same elderly women who had inspected bodies all summer, continued their melancholy work. They were, by necessity, rough and rapid in their judgments. Family influence, bribery, and fear all weighed heavily on what they chose to write down. To call a death plague had consequences for the living: quarantine, lost income, perhaps starvation. A coin pressed into a palm or a desperate plea could tip the balance toward a safer label: fever, consumption, surfeit, dropsy. Thus the official records blossomed with euphemisms and catch-all diagnoses. People were listed as having died from teeth, a common label for infant deaths; rising of the lights, a vague term for chest troubles; griping in the guts, almost anything abdominal, or even frighted, as if fear itself had killed them outright. Some entries sound almost like black jokes from our vantage, but they represented grim compromises made in real kitchens and parlors. During the height of the plague, when death was at its thickest, such creative accounting multiplied. Parish clerks, who gathered these reports from the searchers and compiled them for the central bills, often went along with the softening of the truth. They understood that the stricter the plague numbers appeared, the more their parish would be shunned and its trade strangled. On top of this deliberate undercounting, the system faced sheer practical collapse at the peak of the crisis. In weeks when more than 7,000 people were dying, there simply were not enough searchers, clerks, or hours in the day to keep perfect track. Bodies were dumped in plague pits without names or notes. Whole households that had been shut up might die inside, to be discovered only after their neighbors had given up knocking. Their deaths, if recorded at all, were often lumped under vague headings. Furthermore, the bills captured only those who, well before the Great Plague, he had already noted their inconsistencies, how certain causes seemed inflated or underreported based on fear or fashion, how errors were baked into the process. He treated the bills not as absolute truth, but as data to be interrogated, weighed, and adjusted. In the aftermath of 1665, those inclined to count carefully knew that the official totals understated reality. When the final tallies were drawn up and printed, the number given for plague deaths in that year was 68,596. It was an appalling figure. Yet it did not match the emptiness people could see around them. Demographers and historians, comparing parish burial records with normal years, adjusting for underreporting, and adding in deaths among non-Anglican groups, have arrived at higher estimates. The most cautious of these modern calculations suggests that over 100,000 people perished in and around London during the outbreak. Some estimates climb higher still. Even if we stay with the lower bound, that means about a quarter of the city's pre-plague population died in less than 12 months. It was not simply a bad year, it was, for the city, a near-mortal wound. The silence that hung over London in the first months of 1666 was therefore not only the quiet after disease. It was the hush of absence, 100,000 conversations never resumed, 100,000 chairs left empty, 100,000 hands not returning to their trades. Yet human beings, as they so often do, started to rebuild their lives almost automatically. The cold had checked the plague. Those who had fled felt safe enough to return. In February 1666, King Charles II and his travelling court came back to Whitehall. That single act functioned as a public proclamation. The worst was over, the capital was again fit for royal lungs. With the court's return, business revived. Ships again jostled for space along the quays. Merchants unlocked their counting houses. Artisans hung out signs. Tavern doors swung open more often, though cautiously. It was not the jubilant resumption of a city that had triumphed, but the hesitant reawakening of one that had barely survived. the plague did not disappear entirely. Through the spring and into the summer of 1666, small outbreaks flickered here and there. But they never turned again into a conflagration. Londoners, though, did not yet know that this would prove to be the last major bubonic plague in their city's history. To them, it was simply a respite granted by providence or by luck. If they had imagined that their trials were behind them, they were soon disillusioned. The next disaster came not in, and it seems failed to extinguish his oven fully. Sparks or embers, left smouldering in the night, found ready companions in nearby firewood and stored flour. Flames caught hold, then leapt to adjacent buildings. The wind that night blew strongly from the east, a fanning hand that drove the blaze westward. Close by stood a yard stacked with hay belonging to the Star Inn fodder that might as well have been oil. Once that ignited, the fire had gained enough strength that ordinary efforts meant little. London's medieval layout turned the accident into catastrophe, in the form of invisible germs, but as something starkly visible. Fire. The summer of 1666 was dry, long, and uncomfortably hot. London's houses, many of them built decades or even centuries before, were mostly of timber, infilled with wattle and daub, their roofs shingled or thatched, their surfaces coated with tar or pitch to repel rain. After weeks with little moisture, such structures were like a vast pile of kindling stacked along narrow channels of cobbled streets. In the small hours of Sunday, September 2nd, in a baker's house on Pudding Lane near London Bridge, a simple domestic oversight lit the fuse. Thomas Fariner, the king's baker, had finished his day's work, and, it seems, the streets were extremely narrow and winding, more like alleys than thoroughfares in many quarters. Upper stories of houses often jutted outward over the street so that buildings leaned almost together overhead, creating sheltered tunnels through which heat and sparks rushed. Along the riverfront, the wharves and warehouses held barrels of pitch and tar, bundles of rope, bales of cloth, casks of brandy, piles of coal, and even stores of gunpowder. Once the fire reached these, it found both fuel and explosive force. The first official reaction was disastrously complacent. The Lord Mayor at that time, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was roused from his sleep and taken to view the blaze. Confronted with the growing flames, he reportedly dismissed it with the remark that a woman might piss it out, then returned home. Whether or not those were his exact words, the spirit of the account rings true. Hesitation, underestimation, and fear of the drastic actions required. For in the 17th century, there was only one truly effective way to stop a large urban fire: creating fire breaks by demolishing houses ahead of the flames. This required speed, authority, and a willingness to sacrifice private property for the common good. Bloodworth and the city aldermen, anxious about legal liabilities and compensation claims, dragged their feet. By the time they considered large-scale demolition, the blaze had surged far beyond any small measures. Again it fell to Samuel Pepys, relentless observer and reluctant herald of disaster, to carry the true scale of the news to the king. From his home he saw the sky reddening and the fire expanding. Realizing this was no manageable blaze, he hurried by boat along the Thames to Whitehall. There he roused the king and described what he had seen in urgent detail. Charles II, whatever his faults, did not hesitate as his mayor had. He empowered city authorities to pull down any buildings needed to halt the fire and placed his brother James, Duke of York, in charge of firefighting operations. But the delay had cost them dearly. For 4 days the flames roared through the heart of London. They leapt across streets, climbed up church towers and down again into neighbouring houses, devoured guild halls, shops and alleys. The noise was overwhelming, the rush and crackle of burning timber, the crash of collapsing roofs, the agonized shouts of people fleeing or trying to save their goods, the intermittent booms of barrels and stored powder exploding. The heat reached such intensity that lead on church roofs melted and poured into the streets in silvery rivers. St. Paul's Cathedral, the grand Gothic centerpiece of the city, encased in scaffolding for repair, became a death trap. Printers and booksellers, trusting in its stone bulk, had stored their valuable stock of books and paper in its crypt. When the flames finally invaded that sanctuary, the mass of fuel turned the cathedral into a furnace. Its roof collapsed, its interior burned out. The fire only began to yield when the wind changed, and when teams, often led personally by the Duke of York, used gunpowder to blow up rows of houses, finally creating effective fire breaks. When the last major flames died down, an ashen, smoking landscape lay where the bustling medieval city had been. More than 13,000 houses, nearly 90 parish churches, countless shops, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, and Old St. Paul's were gone. A great part of London's centuries-old built fabric had been erased in less than a week. In the aftermath, people quickly began telling themselves a consoling story. According to this tale, the Great Fire had been a grim kind of blessing. It had burned away the filth-ridden, rat-infested slums where the plague had raged, cleansing the city once and for all of its most deadly disease. Fire, in this view, had finished what cold had started, purifying London both spiritually and physically. Like many powerful myths, this one contains a thread of truth woven into a tapestry of exaggeration. It is correct that the fire destroyed some of the most densely packed and unsanitary neighborhoods within the old walled city. The crowded wooden houses, the garbage that clogged their alleys, the rats that nested in their beams and floors, all of these were consumed. But the timing undermines the claim that the fire ended the plague. By September 1666, when the bakery on Pudding Lane caught fire, the epidemic's great wave had already subsided. For nearly a year, plague deaths had been at relatively low, sporadic levels. The cold seasons of 1665 and early 1666 had already crippled the disease's spread. In truth, the fire did little more than deliver a final brutal blow to a foe already brought to its knees by climate and biology. Its primary legacy was not medical. It was urban and cultural. The destruction of an old city and the opportunity, or perhaps the necessity, to build a new one. In the charred ruins, amid smouldering timbers and toppled walls, some of England's most imaginative minds saw for a moment a blank canvas. From the ashes of the medieval city, an extraordinary possibility briefly shimmered into view. For the first time in centuries, the dense knot of London's streets lay open. Planners and visionaries imagined sweeping away the old disorder and replacing it with a rational, airy, and splendid new metropolis. Architects, scholars, and would-be reformers hurried to sketch their proposals while smoke still drifted above the ruins. Among them, Christopher Wren, already known as a brilliant mathematician and astronomer, put forward a plan that would have transformed London completely. In Wren's vision, the rebuilt city would no longer be a warren of cramped, twisting lanes. Instead, wide boulevards would cut clean lines through the landscape, radiating from large open squares. Churches and public buildings would be strategically placed at key points, creating grand vistas, long, straight views, terminating in imposing facades or towers. The plan drew inspiration from the recent developments in Paris and from the orderly magnificence of Rome. It was a design of logic and spectacle, streets roomy enough to prevent the worst fires, airy enough, so people thought, to disperse unhealthy vapors, and laid out so that traffic could move efficiently. Others produced similar schemes. John Evelyn, a gentleman scholar and friend of Pepys, drew up his own geometrical plan for a reimagined London, as did Robert Hooke, an ingenious scientist and surveyor. All these proposals shared a common spirit. They sought to use catastrophe as a chance to force the city into a more modern, healthier shape. On paper, they were magnificent. In the streets, they were doomed from the start. The chief barrier was not a lack of creativity, but the stubborn reality of property and law. London was not a patch of royal land that the king could simply redraw with a stroke of the pen. Every small plot of earth in the devastated area belonged to someone: a merchant, a guild, an innkeeper, a widow, a church. To impose a new grid of streets and squares would have meant compulsorily acquiring or reallocating thousands of tiny parcels, and then redistributing them according to a grand design. 17th century England had neither the bureaucratic machinery nor the political appetite for such a mass expropriation. Private property was deeply entrenched as a right. The Civil War and the execution of Charles I were still vivid memories. Charles II, restored to his throne barely 6 years earlier, was in no position to antagonize the very merchants and landowners on whose cooperation his stability depended. Time, too, pressed hard. London was not just a place where people lived, it was the engine of the nation's trade and finance. As long as its commercial heart lay in ruins, the entire country suffered. There was immense pressure to rebuild quickly, not perfectly. In the end, the dream of a Baroque London, a city of grand avenues and formal symmetry, gave way to a more pragmatic compromise. The basic medieval street pattern, with all its quirks and crookedness, largely reasserted itself. Property owners rebuilt on the same foundations, in roughly the same footprint that their old houses had occupied. The labyrinth remained, though somewhat tidied, widened in places and straightened where it was easy to do so. Yet it would be wrong to say that no lessons were learned. The rebuilding, though conservative in layout, was radical in its materials and regulations. Parliament moved with unusual speed to pass the Rebuilding Act of 1667, a piece of legislation that became a milestone in urban planning. It did not try to impose a whole new map on London, but it did lay down strict rules about what could be built and how. Foremost among these was the abandonment of timber as the main visible construction material. External walls of new houses were to be made of brick or stone, no longer of wood. Roofs and external surfaces had to be much less flammable. 4 general types of house were defined, based on their location. For example, whether they stood on a principal street or in a lane, and each type came with specific requirements about height, wall thickness, and other structural features. Streets were to be widened where feasible. The hazardous custom of jettying upper stories out over the roadway so that buildings leaned toward each other was forbidden. New houses rose in mainly vertical lines, producing straighter street profiles and more open sky between facades. This allowed more daylight and air into the thoroughfares, still thought of in terms of clearing miasmas, but with real practical advantages nonetheless. The regulations extended to party walls and chimneys, insisting on better separation between houses and safer designs for fireplaces and flues. Although the legislators still believed disease spread via bad air rather than microscopic organisms, their desire to reduce fire risk resulted in houses that were by accident somewhat less hospitable to pests and moisture. A city largely built of brick and stone was harder for rats to burrow through than a city of wooden beams and thatch. Better built drains and the gradual paving of more streets reduced standing filth, at least in the central districts. Wider roads made it a little harder for fires to jump from side to side. These were not cures for all London's ills, but they marked a significant shift from a purely organic, unregulated growth toward a more consciously managed urban environment. While Wren's grand city plan was shelved, he himself was not. Instead of reshaping the entire street system, he was entrusted with rebuilding many of its most important churches. In the years that followed, he designed or redesigned 51 parish churches and, as his crowning achievement, a new St. Paul's Cathedral. The new St. Paul's, with its great dome, classical lines, and commanding presence on Ludgate Hill, became a symbol of the reborn city, different in style and spirit from the Gothic original, but no less monumental. It announced that London, though humbled and scarred, intended not just to exist, but to stand with dignity. Alongside the architectural transformation, quieter changes were unfolding in the ecology of the city. Over the next decades and centuries, the black rat, Rattus rattus, the nimble climbing species that had long lived in the rafters and walls of human dwellings, gradually ceded its place to a larger, more aggressive newcomer, the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. This new rat preferred burrows, embankments, and sewers to attics and lofts. It still lived close to humans, but a little farther from their bodies than its cousin had. Combined with improvements in building materials and layout, this shift meant that the conditions that had allowed the bubonic plague to flourish were no longer so easily met. London would face many diseases and crises in the centuries to come: cholera, smallpox, influenza, war, and bombardment. But the particular pattern of rat-flea-human transmission that drove the Great Plague never again found such ideal circumstances. To commemorate the fire, Wren and Hooke designed an elegant towering column of Portland stone that still rises near the place where Pudding Lane once ran. Known simply as the Monument, it stands 202 feet high. That height is not incidental. If the column were laid flat, its tip would just reach the bakery site where the flames began. Originally, Latin inscriptions around its base told the story of the conflagration and its rebuilding. For a time, the monument also served as a scientific tool. Hooke, ever ingenious, used its hollow central shaft for experiments in gravity and air pressure. But in the public mind, it functioned and still functions, primarily as a reminder, a vertical scar on the skyline, marking where fire once devoured the city's heart. The plague left no similar single structure. Its memorial was more diffuse, woven into memory and culture. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, published decades later, though not a first-hand diary, combined records, oral histories, and imagination into a narrative that has shaped how generations picture 1665. In its pages appear all the elements we have followed: the deserted streets, the shut-up houses, the death carts, the pits, the terror, and the strange mixture of cruelty and courage. Even children's rhymes, it is said, carry faint echoes of that time. Ring a roses, with its talk of pocket full of posies, sneezing, and we all fall down, has often been associated with plague symptoms and remedies, though scholars still argue about the rhyme's true origins. Whether that specific connection is accurate or not, the fact that such an association took root shows how deeply the plague became embedded in cultural imagination. Together, plague and fire forced London into a kind of accelerated modernization. They did not do away with poverty, filth, or injustice. They did not instantly produce germ theory or modern sanitation. But they exposed, in the starkest way, the vulnerabilities of a medieval city that had grown huge without planning. In response, the idea that the state and city authorities had a duty to regulate building and urban health took firmer hold. The Rebuilding Act was an early expression of this notion, that how houses were built, how wide streets should be, and what materials could be used were not purely private matters. Over time, such thinking expanded into more comprehensive systems of building codes, fire brigades, and public health boards. When we walk through London today, past endless brick terraces, along regularly paved streets, under the dome of St. Paul's, we are moving through a city whose shape was profoundly influenced by the disasters of the 1660s. Many of its hidden rules and protections trace their lineage back to those desperate months when carts rumbled at night and bells would not stop ringing. The Great Plague of 1665 was the last of its kind in England, a final devastating visitation of a disease that had haunted Europe for centuries. The Great Fire of 1666, arriving on its heels, erased much of the physical setting in which that disease had thrived. Out of the dual trauma emerged a different London, still congested, still imperfect, but more controlled, more fire-resistant, and, by accident and design, less hospitable to the old spectre of bubonic plague. The scars never completely faded. For generations, 1665 and 1666 served as grim benchmarks for every later misfortune. Writers and preachers invoked the Year of the Plague and the Year of the Fire as shorthand for ultimate calamity. They became part of the city's mental furniture, reminders that even the mightiest trading hub could be brought low by a microscopic organism or a spark in a bakery. Yet out of those wounds grew institutions and habits that still protect city dwellers now. Fire codes, planned rebuilding after disasters, the systematic recording and analysis of deaths for public health purposes, all of these find ancestors in the decisions made then by harried clerks, stubborn mayors, anxious kings, and ordinary Londoners trying to survive. So the story we have followed, from the first quiet deaths in St. Giles, through the fevered summer of tolling bells, past the roaring furnaces of Pudding Lane, into the brick and stone city that rose afterward, is not only a tale of suffering, it is also, quietly, a tale of adaptation. A metropolis was broken, and then, piece by piece, reassembled into something tougher and more regulated. A city forged in pestilence and reforged in flame. Its memory is carried not only in books and monuments, but in the very feel of its streets, the line of its roofs, and the shape of its laws. And now, as that distant city's story recedes from your thoughts, you can let your own mind drift into stillness. The noise of its carts, the ringing of its bells, the murmur of its prayers and bargains all fade away. The tale has run its course for tonight. There is nothing more to add now, only the quiet that follows, and whatever rest you choose to take within it.